The sharp bite of Tyler's words stung as he sneered. "You're just leftovers too." Still, I kept my gaze steady, the weight of his disrespect pressing down. As the laughter of family filled the room, I focused on the sweet scent of dessert, hiding the cold deed beneath the layers of cake. While they continued their chatter, I realized my grandson had taken more than he could ever understand. That's when I decided, as his grandmother, to serve him a lesson he'd never forget. One where respect is earned, not demanded. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. The Thompson family's Thanksgiving dinner was everything Eleanor had hoped for, yet nothing like she expected. The familiar scent of roasted turkey and pumpkin pie filled the air, mingling with the hum of conversation and laughter. The table was set with care, her finest china and silverware gleaming under the soft lighting of the dining room chandelier. Eleanor had spent days preparing, wanting everything to be perfect, wanting this family gathering to be a time of warmth and unity. But then, there was Tyler. At 25, he was the embodiment of entitlement, his sharp tongue and arrogant smirk often at the center of attention. Eleanor had always tried to overlook his growing sense of superiority, telling herself it was just a phase. But today, as she set down the last dish and looked around the table, she knew this Thanksgiving would be different. Tyler was already pushing the boundaries. "These mashed potatoes are fine, I guess," Tyler said, poking at his plate as he looked around at the spread, his voice dripping with condescension. "I mean, they're probably the best thing here, considering we're in Mom's house and she's stuck in the past. Guess she hasn't updated her recipes since the 70s, huh?" Laughter followed his remark, though Eleanor wasn't sure if it was genuine or just nervous tension from the rest of the family. She could feel her pulse quicken, her chest tightening with the all-too-familiar sting of disrespect. She placed a hand on the back of her chair, steadying herself. It was just a remark. Just a joke. But as Tyler's smug grin widened, she could feel the edges of her patience start to fray. "Tyler." Clara, his mother, said softly, her tone a mixture of embarrassment and warning. "That's enough. We're all family here. Let's just enjoy the meal." But Tyler wasn't listening. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, his eyes scanning the room as if he was conducting an audience. His gaze landed on Eleanor, and for a moment, she thought perhaps, just perhaps, he might apologize. But he didn't. Instead, he opened his mouth again, and Eleanor could feel the tension in the room shift. "You know, Nana," he said, his voice louder now, more pointed, "you're just leftovers too. I mean, look at you. You're not getting any younger. It's like you're a relic from another time, all dried up, like the turkey skin, just left there to rot. No offense." The words sliced through the air, cutting deeper than any of his previous jabs. The room went still. The sound of silverware clinking against plates seemed to echo in the silence. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat, a bitter taste rising in her mouth. Leftovers, too. She had heard many things in her life, some of them cruel, some of them petty, but nothing had ever felt as harsh as that. The implication was clear. She was useless, outdated, just a burden to be discarded when the next generation was ready to take the stage. Her hand trembled slightly as she placed it on her lap, willing herself to stay calm. For the family, she reminded herself. For Clara, for Tommy, for this fleeting moment of normalcy. But the words continued to echo in her mind. She had spent years raising her children, nurturing this family. And now this was how she was repaid? With mockery? With insults from her own flesh and blood? Tyler, oblivious to the weight of his words, was still speaking. "I mean, really, we can't expect things to stay the same forever, right? I'm just saying, maybe it's time for you to let go of this house and, I don't know, move somewhere more appropriate for your age." Eleanor felt a tightness form in her chest, a ball of heat threatening to erupt. Her vision blurred for a moment. She hadn't planned on confronting Tyler like this. Not today. Not now. But in that moment she felt something inside her snap. Clara shot her a pleading glance, but Eleanor couldn't meet her eyes. The sting of Tyler's words still rang in her ears. She didn't even recognize him anymore. This wasn't the sweet little boy she had raised, who had clung to her skirts for comfort when he scraped his knee. This was a stranger. A stranger who felt entitled to pass judgment on her life. With forced composure, she cleared her throat. "Tyler, I don't think that's necessary," Eleanor said, her voice tight but steady. She met his gaze, the anger building beneath her calm exterior. "You don't know everything. You never have." Tyler gave her a mockingly puzzled look. "What's the matter, Nana? Did I hit a nerve?" "Sorry, I forgot you were still living in the past." Eleanor's gaze hardened. She wasn't going to back down. Not now. Not ever. The rest of the family sat in silence, the tension thick in the air. Tyler's smugness didn't waver, but Eleanor could feel something inside her shift. She wasn't going to let this slide. Not again. Not after everything she had done for him, for this family. She stood slowly, her eyes never leaving Tyler's. "You'll learn, Tyler," she said quietly, the words carrying more weight than she intended. "You'll learn that disrespect doesn't go unpunished." Tyler chuckled, still unaware of the storm he had just stirred. "Sure, Nana, whatever you say." But Eleanor was no longer listening. The insult had cut too deep. And as the last crumbs of Thanksgiving dinner were eaten, Eleanor quietly retreated into herself, the realization settling heavily in her heart. This was just the beginning. The clink of silverware and the murmur of family voices faded as Eleanor retreated to the quiet sanctuary of her study. The heavy door clicked shut behind her, and she let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Her fingers pressed into the wooden desk, steadying herself. The soft glow of the desk lamp cast long shadows across the room, the smell of fresh coffee still lingering in the air, mixing with the faint scent of old books and leather. Tyler's words echoed in her mind, a relentless drumbeat. "You're just leftovers, too." Every syllable felt like a fresh wound. She had raised him, loved him, and now he saw her as nothing more than an outdated relic. It wasn't just the insult. It was the sheer audacity, the sense of entitlement that came with it. Tyler had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Her gaze fell to the stack of papers on her desk, the ones she'd been avoiding for months, her legal documents, the deeds. She had made the decision to put them aside after her husband had passed, not wanting to deal with the practicalities while she was still grappling with grief. But now, everything felt different. She could feel the weight of the house pressing down on her, the legacy that had once been a symbol of comfort, now a constant reminder of her vulnerabilities. Eleanor's eyes flicked over the top of the pile and landed on the envelope tucked underneath. It was thick, the legal papers inside crisp, untouched, waiting. Her hand hovered over the envelope for a moment before she pulled it open. The soft rustle of paper filled the room as she carefully unfolded the deed to her house. The house she had built with her late husband, the house that held memories of her children's laughter, of Christmas mornings and Easter egg hunts. And now it was more than just a home. It was her last bastion of control. Her fingers traced the bold print of the deed as she read the familiar words. "This property, in full, is to remain under the ownership of Eleanor Thompson." Her breath hitched. The house was hers, completely and unequivocally. No one had the right to it except for her. And certainly not Tyler. A cold determination began to replace the anger that had consumed her during dinner. The more she thought about it, the clearer it became. Tyler wasn't just disrespecting her. He was acting as though he was entitled to everything she had built. The house, the memories, the life she had worked so hard for. It was all there for the taking. in his mind. Eleanor straightened in her chair, a sense of clarity washing over her. Tyler's behavior wasn't just a one-off insult. It was part of a larger pattern, one she had been blind to for too long. The entitlement. The assumption that everything would eventually be handed to him. The lack of gratitude. It was all coming into focus. She had let it slide, thinking it was just youthful arrogance. But now, it was clear. Tyler didn't think she had a right to keep her home. He thought he deserved it. Her hand shook slightly as she retrieved her phone from the drawer. The screen lit up with the name, David Grant. Eleanor had trusted David for years. He had handled everything for her. Legal, financial, you name it. If anyone could help her make the next move, it was him. Her thumb hovered over his contact information for a long beat before she pressed the call button. The phone rang, its soft buzz vibrating in her palm. After 3 rings, David answered. His calm, steady voice was a lifeline. "Eleanor? What's going on?" "I need your help, David," Eleanor said, her voice low, steady. "I'm making a change. It's time for me to take control of the situation." There was a brief pause on the other end. "What's happened?" "Tyler crossed a line today. He thinks he has a right to my house, to my life. I'm done being passive about this. I need to know what I can do legally to secure it." David's voice grew more focused, professional. "I understand. I'll start looking into the best course of action. But Eleanor, I need to ask, are you sure about this? If we move forward, this could cause some serious friction within the family." "I don't care about that anymore," Eleanor said firmly. "Tyler thinks he can walk all over me because I'm older, because he thinks I'm weak. I'm not weak, David, and I'm not going to let him tear down everything I've worked for." She could hear David's silence on the other end, processing. "All right. We'll start working on this. I'll have everything ready for you, Eleanor, but I want you to be prepared for the fallout." "I'm ready," she replied, her voice unwavering. "Let's make this official." As she hung up, Eleanor felt a sharp, decisive sense of power settle in her chest. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she had regained control. Tyler had no idea what was coming for him. She stood from her chair, the deed still clenched tightly in her hand. Her eyes scanned the room, her gaze lingering on the photographs lining the walls. Images of a life well lived, of triumphs and challenges, of family. Tyler's words, though cruel, had lit a fire in her that would not be extinguished. No one, not even her own flesh and blood, would take what was rightfully hers. Her hand tightened around the papers, her mind already running through the steps. The deed was just the beginning. And Tyler? He had no idea what kind of storm he was about to unleash. With a steadying breath, Eleanor turned toward the window, watching the last of the daylight fade from the sky. This was just the start. The house was quiet now, a heavy stillness settling over it like a blanket. Eleanor sat at the kitchen table, a cup of tea untouched in front of her, her mind buzzing with thoughts of what was to come. The soft hum of the refrigerator was the only sound, a small reminder of the ordinary life she had fought so hard to preserve. But tonight, she was no longer simply Eleanor Thompson, grandmother and matriarch. Tonight, she was a woman with a plan to take back control. The phone rang, slicing through the silence. It was David. "David," Eleanor said, her voice firm, as though she had already made the decision she was about to share. "I want you to prepare the legal documents to transfer the deed to me completely. No strings attached. I need to make sure it's ironclad. Tyler doesn't get a say in this anymore." She could hear David's steady exhale on the other end. "Eleanor, are you sure? This could escalate things in ways you might not anticipate. If Tyler challenges you—" "He will," she interrupted, her voice steady. "And when he does, I'll be ready. But I need to be prepared first. Make sure it's all legal. If Tyler thinks he can disrespect me, I'll show him just how far he's miscalculated. There was a pause, but David didn't argue. He knew her well enough by now. All right, I'll start working on it immediately. I'll have a draft ready for you tomorrow. Eleanor hung up, her heart pounding with a mixture of anticipation and something darker, a feeling that perhaps, for the first time in a long while, she was going to finally take back control. She wasn't just protecting her house anymore, she was protecting herself, her autonomy, her life. And Tyler, with all his arrogance, was going to learn that respect couldn't be demanded. It had to be earned. She stood and crossed to the window. The night was clear, the stars twinkling above like distant promises. She thought about the family gathering to come, the next holiday, the next dinner where Tyler would no doubt assume he had the upper hand, where he would continue to test the limits of her patience. Not this time. Her fingers grazed the smooth surface of the counter, and then, like a quiet whisper of inspiration, an idea began to form in her mind. She turned quickly, walking to the kitchen cabinet and pulling out the elegant serving plates she had inherited from her mother. The china, reserved for special occasions, would be perfect. She set them down gently, as though the decision already carried weight. A smirk played at the corner of her mouth. She had always prided herself on creating an atmosphere of comfort, warmth, and tradition. But she knew, deep down, that tradition had its limits, and Tyler's disrespect had reached the breaking point. She wasn't just going to hand him the deed, she was going to make him work for it, make him face the consequences of his behavior in front of the people who mattered most: family. Her mind flicked back to Maggie, her oldest and truest friend. Maggie, who had always been there to offer advice when Eleanor had doubts. She picked up her phone again, dialing the familiar number. Maggie answered on the third ring, her voice warm but knowing. "Eleanor? What's going on?" Eleanor exhaled slowly, the tension that had built in her shoulders easing just a fraction. "I'm moving forward. I'm going to confront Tyler." Maggie's voice dropped, a note of concern threading through it. "You're sure? You know this could tear the family apart, right? It's going to get ugly." "I know," Eleanor replied quietly. "But he's already torn it apart with his disrespect. I'm not going to let him take what's mine. Not anymore." There was a long silence before Maggie spoke again. "Then you know what you have to do. Be bold, Eleanor. Don't hold back. He needs to understand that you're not afraid of him. You're not afraid of anyone." Eleanor smiled at the simplicity of Maggie's wisdom. "I've spent my life being afraid of rocking the boat, of keeping the peace. But not anymore. I've kept my peace long enough." "Well then," Maggie said, her voice filled with approval, "if you're going to make a statement, make it a good one." Eleanor's pulse quickened as she hung up the phone. She moved to the counter again, her eyes scanning the ingredients she had on hand. A dessert, perhaps? A pie, rich with layers, as intricate as her plan. But it had to be something that would catch Tyler off guard, something that would force him to take a hard look at the consequences of his actions. She decided on a decadent layered cake, a grand dessert, something he would never suspect of holding a secret. She would conceal the deed within the layers, slip it into his hands with the same care she had given to the house over the years. A sweet moment, but a bitter lesson. As Eleanor worked, preparing the dessert, a new calm settled over her. She wasn't just a grandmother anymore. She wasn't just the quiet matriarch who had held everything together for so long. She was a force to be reckoned with. When she was done, she stood back and looked at the cake. It was perfect, beautiful, enticing, with just a hint of sweetness and surprise. Her hand hovered over the deed for a moment before she tucked it carefully between the layers of the cake, her heart racing. This was it, the beginning of the end. Tyler had no idea what he was about to face, and Eleanor, well, She was done being underestimated. The day had arrived. Thanksgiving dinner at Eleanor's house was almost a replica of the previous year. Almost. The table was set with the same fine china, the same elegant crystal goblets catching the light. The aroma of turkey and stuffing filled the air, laced with the warmth of mashed potatoes and gravy, the comforting smell of a family meal. Yet, beneath the surface of the familiar, there was a tension, an undercurrent that no amount of placid small talk could conceal. Tyler was the first to arrive, his presence already filling the room with an energy that bordered on arrogance. As Eleanor set the last of the dishes on the table, Tyler flopped into his chair, a mischievous grin plastered on his face. It was as though he was trying to provoke a reaction, testing the boundaries, seeing how far he could go before anyone would stop him. "So, Nana," Tyler said, eyeing the spread with a smirk, "looks like you've finally gotten the hang of Thanksgiving. It only took you, what, a couple of decades?" Eleanor's eyes briefly met Clara's, but her daughter's gaze quickly shifted away, as though she could not bear to see the hurt in her mother's eyes. Tyler, oblivious as ever, continued, leaning back in his chair, his arms casually resting on the armrests. "Though, I'm surprised you didn't swap out the turkey for something more modern," he added, his words laced with that familiar, condescending tone. "You know, maybe some organic, gluten-free thing. I mean, we're not in the 70s anymore, right?" The rest of the family shifted uncomfortably, but Tyler's words had become as routine as the holiday itself. No one challenged him. No one, it seemed, dared to. Except Eleanor. She kept her face neutral, but inside, she was seething. Her heart was heavy with the knowledge that he still hadn't grasped the depth of his disrespect. He was still that same selfish boy who assumed the world was his for the taking. But today, he would learn otherwise. Dinner passed in a haze of strained conversation and forced smiles. Eleanor's thoughts were elsewhere, constantly returning to the cake she had prepared, the dessert that would carry with it a lesson Tyler could not ignore. After the meal, as everyone began to relax, settling back with their drinks, Eleanor rose slowly from the table. She didn't say a word, didn't need to. Tyler was already leaning forward, his eyes scanning the room for something else to mock, some new target for his relentless jabs. "Time for dessert," Eleanor said quietly, her voice sharp enough to cut through the casual chatter. She made her way to the kitchen and returned with the cake, a masterpiece. It was grand, towering and decadent, with layers of rich chocolate and creamy frosting that seemed to beckon the eye, a delicate dusting of powdered sugar on top. She set it down in the center of the table, a gleaming silver knife beside it, and then, as though giving them all a moment to wonder, she stepped back. Tyler's eyes lit up as he saw the dessert. "Now, this is what I'm talking about. Looks like something worth my time," he said, leaning forward eagerly. "I'm guessing Nana's saved the best for last." He grabbed the knife, clearly intent on claiming the first slice for himself, and began cutting into the cake. The knife slid smoothly through the layers, but then, Tyler's motion stuttered. The blade caught on something hard inside the cake, something that didn't belong there. He frowned, irritated, and pushed harder. With a final, frustrated motion, he lifted the piece of cake, and there it was. Something folded within, its edges peeking out from beneath the rich chocolate frosting. What's this?" Tyler muttered, reaching down to pull the object free. The room fell silent. All eyes were on Tyler, whose hands trembled slightly as he unfurled the paper from the layers of cake. His expression shifted from confusion to disbelief as he realized what he was holding: the deed to Eleanor's house. A stunned silence enveloped the room. The hum of conversation died entirely. Everyone's gaze flicked nervously between Eleanor and Tyler, as though waiting for the inevitable explosion. Tyler's face flushed with embarrassment, then quickly darkened with anger. What the hell is this, Nana? His voice rose, edged with frustration, but beneath the surface, there was something else. Fear. For the first time, he looked less sure of himself, less in control. Eleanor stood, her back straight, her gaze unyielding. She moved slowly toward him, the weight of the moment settling over her like a cloak. The rest of the family watched, caught between shock and curiosity. That, Tyler, Eleanor began, her voice calm but firm, is the deed to this house. My house. The one I've worked my whole life to protect. She paused, letting the words sink in. You've taken far too much for granted, Tyler. I've let your disrespect slide for too long, but not anymore. You wanted to treat me like leftovers. Well, now you'll see what happens when you take too much. Tyler blinked, trying to regain his composure, but his fingers were still shaking as he gripped the paper. You're messing with me, right? This is some kind of joke? No joke, Eleanor replied, her voice steady. You mocked my age, my decisions. You thought you could take everything from me, but you'll learn, Tyler. There are consequences to disrespecting those who have given you everything. The room was still, the tension so thick it was suffocating. Tyler opened his mouth to respond, but the words seemed to catch in his throat. For the first time, he didn't have a quick comeback. His arrogance faltered, and beneath it, the fear began to creep in. Eleanor watched him closely, knowing that this was the moment. This was when he would either begin to understand or double down. The clock was ticking, and for the first time, she realized that Tyler's world had just shifted on its axis. The dessert was served, and so was the lesson. The silence stretched, suffocating in its intensity. Tyler's hand shook as he held the deed, the paper crumpling in his grip. He blinked rapidly, his mouth opening and closing, as if searching for words that would help him regain control of the situation. But the words didn't come, not immediately. Instead, his expression morphed from confusion to outrage, his jaw tightening as the full weight of what had just occurred crashed into him. You've got to be kidding me, Nana, Tyler finally spat, his voice rising with a fury that seemed to come from deep within. He shoved the paper back into the folds of the cake, his fingers trembling. This is how you're going to treat me? In front of everyone? Eleanor stood tall, her back straight and her gaze unwavering. The anger in Tyler's voice barely registered, her resolve now fortified by the calm that had settled in her chest. The storm he was trying to unleash had no power here. Not anymore. Not when the truth was so clear. Tyler, Eleanor said evenly, her voice cutting through his tirade like a sharp knife. This is not about humiliation. This is about respect. You have spent years thinking you can take whatever you want from this family, thinking I'd just roll over. You're wrong. Tyler's face flushed with a mixture of embarrassment and fury, and he slammed his hands down on the table, rattling the plates. You're humiliating me. You think this is funny? You think this is some kind of joke? His voice broke slightly, but the venom behind the words only sharpened. Clara, who had been sitting quietly, her face pale, suddenly stood up. Her hands were outstretched, trying to calm the storm. Tyler, stop. This is ridiculous. This is your grandmother, for God's sake. Why are you treating her like this? Tyler whipped around to face Clara, his eyes wild. Mom, don't tell me how to feel. This is insane. She's taking the house away from me. Everything I've ever worked for, and she's just giving it away like this. You can't seriously be okay with this. Clara's eyes darted between Tyler and Eleanor, the weight of the situation pressing down on her. She opened her mouth, but the words seemed to get stuck in her throat. She was torn, caught between her loyalty to her son and the undeniable truth of her mother's actions. For a moment she looked at Eleanor, really looked at her, and saw not the fragile, aging woman who had raised her, but someone who had fought, and fought for everything she had. Someone who had earned it. And then her gaze shifted back to Tyler, to the boy she had raised, who had always taken, never given. Clara's voice was quiet when it finally came. Tyler, you've pushed her too far. You have to see that. The words stung. Tyler's chest heaved, his face contorting with disbelief and rage. I don't believe this. I really don't. You, both of you, are siding with her? After everything I've done for this family? I'm siding with what's right, Tyler, Clara said, her voice gaining strength. What you've done isn't right. Not anymore. A deep, bitter laugh escaped Tyler's lips, but there was no humor in it, just raw, burning anger. You're all so damn predictable, he muttered, glaring at each of them in turn. I thought this was my family. I thought they'd stand by me. But no, you're all just puppets for her. You'll all regret this. Eleanor felt a pang in her chest, but it was brief, swiftly replaced by the steel of her determination. She stepped forward, her voice unwavering. Tyler, listen to me, she said softly, but with a strength that seemed to ground the room. I've worked my entire life for this house, for this family. I've done everything for you, for your mother, for your brother. But you've forgotten the most important thing: respect. You don't get to walk all over me because you think I'm old, or because you feel entitled to something that isn't yours. This house, this legacy is mine, and now I'm making sure it stays that way. If you can't respect that, then you don't get to be a part of it. Tyler's face twisted, his expression now a mask of fury. I'm done with this, he spat, his words barely controlled. He stood up abruptly, knocking his chair backward with a loud scrape. You've made your decision, Eleanor, and trust me, you'll regret it. This family, this house, none of it is worth the damage you're about to cause. Without another word, Tyler turned sharply and stormed out of the room. The door slammed behind him with a force that seemed to echo through the house, leaving a stunned silence in its wake. The tension that had filled the room only moments before seemed to drain away, leaving behind a brittle, uncomfortable quiet. Clara remained standing, her eyes searching Eleanor's face for any sign of doubt, but found none. Maggie, who had been sitting in the corner watching the exchange with quiet support, finally spoke up. You did the right thing, Eleanor, Maggie said, her voice strong and steady, cutting through the air like a balm. He needed to understand. He needed to know where the line is. Eleanor's shoulders relaxed, her breath steadying. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked out the window, watching as the last light of day faded into twilight, the house settling into a soft, almost eerie quiet. The weight of the moment hung heavy in the air. Tyler had left, but the battle wasn't over. The real consequences had only just begun. And Eleanor? She was ready. But would the rest of the family stand with her when the storm broke? The air in the house felt colder after Tyler stormed out, the door slamming behind him with a finality that echoed in Eleanor's chest. The weight of the confrontation lingered, but it was quickly replaced by a certain stillness, a sense of calm certainty. She had done what needed to be done, and now there was no turning back. But as the tension ebbed from the room, it was replaced by something else: doubt. Clara stood off to the side, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her gaze on the floor. Maggie, ever the steady presence, was the first to break the silence. You did the right thing, Eleanor, she said, her voice low but unwavering. Tyler needed to hear that. He needed to understand the boundaries you've set. Eleanor nodded, but the ache in her chest hadn't disappeared. Had she made the right choice? She watched Clara, who was still standing by the window, her face a mask of uncertainty. The silence between them stretched thin, fragile like a taut wire. I never thought it would come to this, Eleanor said, breaking the quiet. Her voice was softer now, the sharp edge of the confrontation fading as she approached her daughter. I thought I thought we could work through things, that Tyler would grow up, that he'd learn to appreciate what we've built here. Clara finally turned, meeting her mother's gaze for the first time since the storm had passed. I don't know what to think anymore, she said quietly. I've always tried to protect Tyler, but seeing him like that, I don't know. I don't recognize him. Eleanor's heart sank. I know, sweetheart, I didn't want this, but Tyler has made his choices, and I had to make mine. Clara let out a breath, as if she was carrying the weight of something too heavy to hold any longer. I never thought he'd go this far. I never thought he'd treat you like this. It's not your fault, Eleanor replied gently. Tyler has been taking for too long, and I've let it slide. He's never had to face the consequences of his actions, and now he will. The room fell into another long silence, but this time it wasn't the oppressive quiet of anger or confusion. It was the silence of a family slowly beginning to come to terms with the harsh truths they had been avoiding. Just then, the phone rang. Eleanor's heart gave a small lurch as she picked it up. The number on the screen was familiar. Tyler. She felt a knot tighten in her stomach as she hesitated for a moment before answering. Eleanor. Tyler's voice came through the receiver, low and strained. You need to reverse this. You need to fix this. Right now. Eleanor's hand tightened around the phone. She could hear the anger, the desperation in his voice, but she remained calm, her grip on the situation firm. No, she said simply. I'm not reversing anything, Tyler. What the hell do you think you're doing? His voice was rising again, a mixture of pleading and rage. You can't just take everything from me. You can't just... You're not entitled to anything, Tyler. Not the house. Not my legacy. I've spent my entire life building this, and you have taken it for granted. You've treated me like I'm disposable, like my hard work doesn't matter. I'm done letting you think you can walk all over me. Tyler's silence on the other end of the line stretched on, but Eleanor could almost hear the gears turning in his head, the manipulation, the schemes he was plotting to try and change her mind. I'm not asking you to understand, she continued, her voice resolute. I'm telling you that you need to start facing the reality of your actions. No more excuses, no more lies. There was a long pause, the kind that made the air thick with tension. And then, in a quieter voice, Tyler spoke again, though the underlying anger was still there. Fine. But you'll regret this, Nana. You've ruined everything. You've destroyed this family. I swear. You'll regret it. I've already made my peace with that, Eleanor replied calmly. I can't control what you do, Tyler, but I can control how I respond, and I'm not backing down. The call ended with a click, leaving Eleanor holding the phone in her hand, her chest tight with the aftershock of the conversation. She placed it back down on the counter, her fingers lingering for a moment before she turned to face Clara. That was him, Eleanor said, her voice steady but heavy with finality. He wants me to reverse my decision, but I won't. Not this time. Clara looked at her mother, her expression conflicted. I don't know what's worse, she said softly. Him acting like he's entitled to everything, or that I'm finally seeing how deep his sense of entitlement goes. I don't know how to fix it, Mom. Eleanor stepped forward, placing a hand on her daughter's shoulder. You don't have to fix it. You just have to stand with what's right. And Tyler, he needs to learn that his actions have consequences. Clara nodded slowly, her gaze far away, lost in the thought of everything that had just been set in motion. Eleanor could see the cracks beginning to form in her daughter's loyalty to Tyler, but it would take time. Tyler had spent years carefully building up his manipulation of her. But like any house of cards, it only took one strong gust of wind to make it collapse. I'll call David tomorrow, Eleanor said, breaking the silence, her voice calm. I need to make sure everything is in order, legally. Clara nodded again, this time with a sense of finality in her movements. I think, I finally understand, but I'm scared, Mom. What happens now? Eleanor met her gaze, her voice firm. Now, we wait, and we prepare for whatever comes next. The truth had been laid bare, but the hardest part was still ahead of them. How they would move forward and how far Tyler would go to reclaim what he believed was his. But for the first time, Eleanor felt certain of one thing. She was no longer the weak, aging matriarch she had been before. She was a force to be reckoned with. And Tyler? He was about to find that out the hard way. The courtroom was stark and cold, the air heavy with the weight of legal jargon and the sharp click of heels against tile. The marble floors gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights, and the wooden paneling of the walls seemed to close in around Eleanor as she sat in the back, waiting. The court was full of people, the murmur of voices a dull hum, but it felt as though she was in a world all her own. She could see Tyler in the front row, his arms folded across his chest, his expression one of defiance. He hadn't changed. Still the same arrogant, entitled young man, only now wearing the facade of a wronged party. He was leaning forward, speaking to his lawyer in hushed tones, trying to strategize, trying to manipulate the situation. Eleanor could feel the anger rising in her chest again, but she took a steadying breath. She had already made her decision, and now it was time to see it through. David, her lawyer, sat beside her, his calm presence a grounding force. His face was set with the professionalism she had come to rely on, but she could see the concern in his eyes. They had gone over everything, every detail, every piece of evidence. Still, the uncertainty of the courtroom, the unknowns of Tyler's next move, lingered in the air like a storm waiting to break. Eleanor's hands rested on the armrests, her fingers gripping the sides of the chair as if they were anchors. Her mind was clear now, more than it had ever been in the weeks since Tyler's outburst. This wasn't just about the house. It wasn't about her legacy. It was about taking back control, about reclaiming the life she had worked so hard to build. Tyler had pushed too far, and now she was going to make him face the consequences. The judge entered the courtroom, his robes sweeping the floor as he took his seat. The room went silent, the sound of rustling papers, the only indication of life in the otherwise still space. Tyler's lawyer, a sharp-suited man with an air of confidence, stood and addressed the court. "Your Honor," he began, his voice smooth and calculated, "we are here today to challenge the legality of the deed transfer to Mrs. Thompson. We contend that Eleanor Thompson was not in her right state of mind when she made this decision. It was an act of vengeance against my client, Tyler Thompson, fueled by personal animus. We request that the court overturn this transfer on the grounds of undue influence and mental incapacity." The words hit Eleanor like a slap, but she didn't flinch. She had expected this. They would try to paint her as irrational, emotional, even unstable. But she knew the truth. She had spent years allowing Tyler to trample over her life, and it had only been a matter of time before someone tried to question her judgment. David stood, his voice firm and steady. "Your Honor, we are here today to uphold the rights of Mrs. Eleanor Thompson. This deed was not transferred out of spite or vengeance, but out of necessity. Necessity for the preservation of her legacy and the protection of her family's property." The lawyer for Tyler shot David a look, but David was undeterred, standing tall and meeting the challenge head-on. Eleanor stood now, her voice clear and confident as she addressed the court. She had prepared for this moment, had rehearsed the words she would say. But standing here, in front of Tyler, in front of the judge, it all felt more real than she had anticipated. "Your Honor," she began, her voice cutting through the tension of the courtroom. "This wasn't about revenge. This was about taking responsibility, taking control of my life again. I have spent my entire life giving to this family, to my children, to my grandchildren. I've worked for everything I have. And Tyler. She paused, her gaze flicking to her grandson, who was sitting with his arms crossed, eyes narrowed. Tyler took that for granted. He has spent years disrespecting me, dismissing everything I've built. He believes that the world owes him something because he's my grandson. She could feel the room shift as she spoke. There was no turning back now. I did not act out of spite, Eleanor continued, her voice gaining strength. I acted because I was forced to. I will not let my legacy be claimed by someone who doesn't appreciate what it represents. I will not allow my home, my memories, my work to be taken by someone who thinks he is entitled to it. Tyler's lawyer shifted in his seat, trying to maintain control, but David's voice cut through the air before he could interrupt. Your Honor, David said, standing beside Eleanor. We have evidence that Tyler's behavior has been detrimental, both financially and emotionally, to Mrs. Thompson. His repeated attempts to manipulate her, his blatant disregard for her autonomy, and his entitlement have all led us to this point. This transfer was a necessary step for Eleanor Thompson to protect what she had rightfully earned. Tyler's lawyer rose, attempting to discredit the claims. But what about the emotional state of Mrs. Thompson? She was clearly upset after a confrontation with her grandson. Can we be sure that this transfer wasn't an act of frustration? David's rebuttal was swift. We have records of the conversations, and there is no indication that Mrs. Thompson acted rashly. She took her time, she consulted with legal professionals, and she made an informed decision. Eleanor could feel the weight of the courtroom on her shoulders, but she stood her ground. She knew what she had to do. The courtroom was full of voices, but it was her voice that rang true. Tyler's eyes flashed with anger. He opened his mouth to say something, but the words caught in his throat. The judge's gavel struck the desk, bringing the room back to attention. Enough, the judge said, his voice low and commanding. I have heard enough. I will review the evidence and deliver my ruling shortly. As the courtroom began to empty, Eleanor felt a surge of strength. She had faced Tyler's manipulation head-on, and she had stood firm. The storm was not over, but for the first time, she felt certain that she had made the right choice. Tyler's glare lingered on her as he left the courtroom. She met his gaze without flinching. This battle wasn't over. But it was far from the end. The courtroom had emptied for a brief recess, but the tension hung heavy in the air like a storm waiting to break. Eleanor remained seated in the same spot, her fingers pressed against the armrest, her mind still sharp with the memory of the confrontation. She could still feel Tyler's glare burning through the back of her head, his words echoing in the silence of the room. But she wasn't going to let him shake her. Not now. Not after everything. David sat beside her, flipping through his legal documents, his brow furrowed in concentration. His calm demeanor had become a reassuring constant through the last few hours. He'd been her rock, helping her build a case that would stand up in court. Now, however, the room felt emptier than before. You did well out there, David said quietly, his voice a low murmur meant only for her ears. But this isn't over yet. We have to keep pushing. Eleanor nodded, her heart pounding with the anticipation of what was to come. She could feel the weight of the decision she'd made pressing down on her. This wasn't just a legal battle. It was personal. She had to win this. As the doors to the courtroom reopened, the murmur of the crowd outside began to seep in. Tyler was back. And this time, the stakes felt higher. She could see the tension in his posture, his shoulders tight, his jaw clenched. He knew the odds were against him now, but Eleanor could see the flicker of desperation in his eyes, the last remnants of the entitlement he still refused to shed. The judge called the court back to order, and the room fell silent once again. Tyler's lawyer stood first, attempting to regain some control over the proceedings. Your Honor? The lawyer began, his voice dripping with feigned calm. We have no further questions for the plaintiff, but we do wish to present new evidence. He motioned to his assistant, who wheeled forward a stack of documents. These records will demonstrate that Mrs. Thompson acted out of rash emotion, and her transfer of the deed was motivated by a personal vendetta against my client. But before he could continue, David stood, interrupting with a sharpness that cut through the lawyer's words. "Your Honor," David said, his tone controlled but firm. "We are aware of the accusations, but I'd like to call attention to the fact that Tyler Thompson's financial mismanagement and irresponsible behavior have been a consistent issue in this family for years. I would like to enter these records into evidence." David presented the files, bank statements, property records, and a series of letters that clearly outlined Tyler's negligence in managing his own finances. The evidence was undeniable. Tyler had drained accounts, made poor investments, and even taken money without consent from Eleanor's accounts. Tyler's lawyer tried to dismiss the evidence, but it was clear that the weight of the documents had caught the court's attention. Tyler's face twisted in frustration as he looked from the documents to the judge, his eyes narrowing. His defense was crumbling, and he could feel it. David pressed on. "Tyler Thompson's actions over the past few years have made it clear that he has no respect for the responsibility that comes with managing wealth. His careless behavior has cost this family dearly, and it is now beyond dispute that he is unfit to lay claim to this house or any of its assets." The courtroom buzzed with murmurs. Tyler shifted in his seat, his earlier composure completely shattered. His lawyer fumbled with the paperwork, trying to salvage something, anything that might turn the tide back in his favor. And then, in a moment that felt like the breaking of a dam, Clara stood. The sound of her chair scraping against the floor echoed across the room, and Eleanor's heart skipped a beat. Clara's voice was steady but laced with emotion. "I need to say something," she began, her gaze sweeping across the courtroom, finally settling on Tyler. "I've been protecting you for so long, Tyler, but I can't do it anymore. I've watched you hurt Mom for years, take from this family without ever giving anything back. I've ignored it because I thought you'd grow up, that you'd realize the impact of your actions. But now, I see it clearly, and I can't pretend anymore." Tyler's eyes widened, his face a mask of disbelief, as his own mother spoke the words he'd never wanted to hear. "You've hurt this family," Clara continued, her voice breaking but unwavering. "And I'm sorry, Tyler. I'm so sorry. But I have to stand with what's right." Eleanor's heart swelled with a mixture of relief and sorrow. This was the moment she had feared, her daughter finally seeing the truth of Tyler's manipulation. But it was also the moment she had needed. Clara was finally seeing what Eleanor had known for years. Tyler's face flushed a deep red as he glared at his mother, his mouth opening and closing in disbelief. "You're choosing her over me?" he spat, his voice cracking. "Your own son?" Clara didn't flinch. "I'm choosing the truth, Tyler, and you need to face it." The courtroom was silent. Even the judge seemed to pause, considering the weight of Clara's words. Tyler's lawyer looked defeated, glancing between the judge and his client. But the damage was already done. Tyler's world was unraveling, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Eleanor stood taller now, the weight of her decision finally settling in. She had fought for this, for her family, for her legacy, and the truth was undeniable. Tyler's manipulation was exposed for what it was, and the court had no choice but to acknowledge it. Tyler looked desperate now, his face twisted in anger and humiliation. His next words came out in a low, guttural growl. "You'll all regret this. You'll see what happens when I'm not around. This family won't survive without me." But as he stormed out of the courtroom, Eleanor stood firm, her resolve unshaken. This was only the beginning. The courtroom buzzed with a quiet energy as the final session began. Eleanor sat at the front, her hands folded neatly on her lap, her posture straight as if she were preparing for the storm that had yet to come. Her mind, however, was clear. She had fought her battle, and now it was a matter of waiting for the judgment. She glanced at David, who sat beside her, his quiet confidence a constant source of support. He had been with her through every step of this, guiding her with steady hands, but now, even he seemed focused, eyes trained on the judge as if waiting for the final piece of the puzzle to fall into place. Tyler sat across the room, his once arrogant posture now slumped, shoulders tight with the weight of his defeat. He had tried to manipulate, twist the truth, and use every trick in the book to regain control. But with each passing hour, with each witness, and with Clara's ultimate stand, Tyler's house of cards had crumbled. The judge entered the room, his gavel hitting the surface with a commanding crack, silencing the room. Everyone stood, the moment heavy with the anticipation of the ruling that would decide everything. "Please be seated," the judge said, his voice calm but authoritative. He adjusted his glasses, his eyes flicking between the lawyers and the parties involved. The air felt thick, as though the room itself was holding its breath. Eleanor's heart pounded in her chest as she sat back down. She felt the weight of everything on her shoulders, but at the same time, there was a strange sense of calm. She had done everything she could. Now, it was out of her hands. The judge looked over the documents laid before him, his hands still and deliberate as he turned the pages. Finally, he addressed the court. After reviewing the evidence presented and hearing from both parties, it is clear that the actions of Tyler Thompson have been not only disrespectful, but, at times, financially irresponsible. While his entitlement is not a criminal offense, it is a character flaw that has significantly impacted the Thompson family. Tyler shifted in his seat, his jaw clenched, but the words didn't seem to penetrate him the way they once might have. He was unraveling, piece by piece. The judge continued, his tone unwavering. "It is also apparent that Eleanor Thompson has acted in her own best interest, not out of malice, but as a necessary step to protect what is rightfully hers. Her decision to transfer the deed was not an impulsive one. It was made after considerable thought and consultation with legal professionals." Eleanor felt a weight lift from her shoulders as the judge's words confirmed what she had known all along. Her actions were justified. The manipulation, the lies, and the entitled behavior of her grandson were no longer in question. She had done what was right, even if the world, particularly Tyler, did not see it that way. The judge paused, as if allowing the gravity of the decision to settle before him. "Therefore," he said, his voice clear and firm, "I rule in favor of Mrs. Eleanor Thompson. The deed and the property in question remain hers, as per her legal rights. Furthermore, Tyler Thompson is ordered to return all funds he has taken from Mrs. Thompson's accounts, both from unauthorized withdrawals and any other misappropriation." A collective exhale rippled through the room, but Tyler remained silent, his face pale, his eyes wide with disbelief. Eleanor didn't look at him. She didn't need to. She had won. Tyler Thompson's attempts to control the situation and claim what is not his have been rejected by this court. This ruling is final, and I expect full compliance. Tyler opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat, the rage bubbling up inside him. But there was nothing left for him to say. His lawyer glanced at him, then back at the judge, before sitting down. It was over. As the judge's gavel hit the desk one final time, sealing the decision, Eleanor stood slowly, feeling the enormity of the moment wash over her. For the first time in a long time, the tightness in her chest loosened. The fight was over, and she had emerged victorious. David stood beside her, his eyes filled with quiet approval. "You did it," he said, a smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "I did," Eleanor replied, her voice thick with emotion. "We did." Clara was already at her side, her eyes wide, full of a mixture of relief and pride. I don't know how to thank you, Mom, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. You showed me what real strength looks like. Eleanor squeezed her daughter's hand, the weight of the past weeks heavy in the way she held Clara, as though they were both finally stepping away from a storm that had torn them apart. Tyler stood at the back of the courtroom, his face twisted in a silent snarl, the defeat written clearly across his features. His world had collapsed, and for the first time, he realized that no amount of manipulation, no amount of entitled rage would change the outcome. The house, the legacy, the power, everything he thought he was owed was slipping through his fingers. Without another word, he turned on his heel and stormed out of the room, his footsteps echoing in the silence he left behind. Eleanor watched him go, but her gaze didn't waver. This was the end of his control over her, the end of his manipulation. As the courtroom emptied and the crowd filtered out, Eleanor, David, and Clara walked out of the courthouse together, the weight of the day finally lifting. The sun was setting outside, painting the sky in deep hues of purple and gold, a perfect mirror of the peace Eleanor was beginning to feel. Tyler might have lost today, but Eleanor had won something far more precious, her peace, and she had no intention of letting it go. The house was quieter now, the hum of life that had once been filled with tension and worry gradually replaced by a peace Eleanor hadn't felt in years. The weight that had hung over her shoulders for so long, the uncertainty of Tyler's manipulation and the legal battles that had consumed her, was gone. She could breathe again. And with that freedom came space to rebuild. It started small, small projects that had been tucked away in the corners of her mind, long forgotten beneath the layers of stress and obligation. The house, which had once felt like a battlefield, was beginning to transform into something that reflected her own growth. She'd begun painting the walls in colors that made her smile, soft blues, warm yellows. She had always loved bright spaces but had never taken the time to let her own personality shine through in the home she had once shared with her late husband. Now, every brushstroke felt like a reclaiming of herself. Eleanor had forgotten how much joy she could take in these small, tactile acts, things that had once been buried under the weight of family expectations and Tyler's demands. As she sanded down the old oak table, she thought about how many years she had spent maintaining it, cleaning it, polishing it, all for the sake of appearances. But now it felt like she was renewing it for her own pleasure, each stroke a small rebellion against the years she had spent in the shadows. The sound of a drill, the smell of fresh paint, the feel of the fabric between her fingers. It all reminded her that she was still capable of doing things for herself, just for the joy of it. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to ask, "What do I want?" And the answer, as simple as it was, felt revolutionary. "I want to create again." One afternoon, Clara joined her in the living room. The two women had been working side by side for hours, each immersed in their own thoughts but also silently supporting one another. Clara was helping Eleanor hang the new curtains in the dining room, and there was a quiet harmony between them, the kind that only came with time and understanding. "I never realized how much you've done for me," Clara said, stepping back to admire the curtains they'd just hung. Her voice was softer now, full of respect, and something deeper. "I've always taken you for granted, Mom. I see that now." Eleanor stopped what she was doing, turning to face her daughter. Her heart swelled, not with pride, but with a quiet relief that this was what she had wanted: understanding. Tyler's departure had fractured the family in ways that hadn't fully healed yet. But with Clara, there was now a quiet kind of peace. It was a different kind of connection, one built not on obligation but on mutual respect. "You never took me for granted, sweetheart," Eleanor said gently, her voice calm but full of meaning. "But it's okay. I think we both needed to see each other in a new way. We're rebuilding together. Clara nodded, her eyes filling with emotion. The years of tension, the unspoken resentments, were all being washed away, piece by piece, as they worked side by side, creating something new. Eleanor felt that same peace begin to settle in her bones, the kind she had forgotten was even possible. As the weeks passed, Eleanor's life continued to change. With the legal battle behind her, she finally felt free. She began to travel, something she had dreamed of for years but had never had the courage to pursue. Her first stop was a small coastal town in Maine, a place she had seen in pictures but had never visited. She spent days walking along the cliffs, breathing in the salty air, feeling the wind on her face. The sea had a way of washing away the past, of reminding her that there was always something more to experience. When she returned home, her heart was full, her spirit lifted. She had crossed oceans, both literal and emotional, and found a new sense of purpose. It wasn't just about the house, the property, or even the court victory. It was about regaining her sense of self, finding the person she had been before life had become consumed with obligation and manipulation. Eleanor also found herself seeking connection with others who had been through similar struggles. She joined a support group for women who had experienced emotional manipulation, women who had been worn down by family expectations and toxic relationships. For the first time in a long time, Eleanor shared her story without shame, and in doing so, she found strength in the collective resilience of the group. It was in these meetings, in the stories shared over coffee and tissue boxes, that she realized she was not alone in this. But even as she built her new life, there was a part of her that knew the journey wasn't over. She had made peace with Tyler's absence, but the hurt and the lessons learned would stay with her forever. She couldn't undo the past, but she could shape the future. One morning, Eleanor sat down at her desk, the sun streaming through the window and casting a warm glow over the room. She pulled out a blank notebook, a gift from David, who had encouraged her to write her story. With a pen in hand, she began to write, not for anyone else, but for herself. The words poured out, messy at first, but eventually coming together. She had already lived through the storm, and now she was telling the story of how she had come through the other side. It wasn't just about the legal battle anymore, or about the years she had spent trying to fix everyone else's problems. It was about her. It was about who she had become and who she was still becoming. And as she wrote, Eleanor knew that she was still building her life, layer by layer, just as she had rebuilt her house, one small decision at a time. As the pages filled, she felt the last pieces of the past fall away. And for the first time in years, Eleanor Thompson truly felt free. Eleanor stood backstage, her hands trembling slightly as she smoothed down the front of her blouse. The lights from the auditorium beyond cast long shadows across the room, and she could hear the rustle of the audience taking their seats, the hum of excited murmurs filling the air. She took a steadying breath, feeling the weight of the moment settle around her like a cloak. This was it. The first time she would publicly share her story, her journey from manipulation to empowerment. It had taken months to get here, months of reflection, of reworking her story into something that was no longer just about survival, but about triumph, about the lessons learned, the strength gained, and the understanding that her worth was never tied to the opinions of others. But still, standing there in the quiet, just behind the curtain, Eleanor could feel the old familiar pangs of doubt creeping in. Can I really do this? She thought. Am I ready to share my truth? But then she remembered the letters she'd received after the support group sessions, the women who had written to her, sharing how her story had resonated with them, how, just by listening, they had started to reclaim their own power. If I could help just one more person today, Eleanor thought, then it will be worth it. A soft knock on the door pulled her from her thoughts. Clara stepped in, her face glowing with pride. "Mom," she said, her voice full of warmth, "you're ready. You've always been ready." Eleanor smiled, the tightness in her chest easing just a little. Clara had been by her side every step of the way, her biggest supporter, and the one who reminded her time and time again that she had something important to share. It hadn't always been this way. Their relationship had been fractured, but they were now stronger than ever, building each other up with each passing day. "I'm scared, Clara," Eleanor admitted quietly. "What if they don't listen? What if I fail?" Clara stepped forward, gently squeezing her mother's hand. "You won't fail. You're already helping people, you just don't see it yet. And I'll be right there with you." Eleanor nodded, her heart swelling with a love so deep it felt almost overwhelming. She wasn't doing this alone anymore. She had her daughter by her side, and together, they had rebuilt something beautiful from the wreckage. The sound of the host calling her name over the loudspeaker pulled her back to the present. The moment had arrived. The spotlight blazed as Eleanor stepped onto the stage, the room falling silent in anticipation. She stood at the podium, her hands gripping the edges, the heat of the spotlight warming her face. She could see the faces of the audience, expectant and hopeful, and for the first time in years, she didn't feel like an outsider. She felt like she belonged. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. "Thank you all for being here today. I'm honored to share my story with you, one that I've kept to myself for far too long. My name is Eleanor Thompson, and for many years, I was a woman who felt lost, overshadowed by those I loved, controlled by those who claimed to know what was best for me. But that changed." As she spoke, memories flooded back of the years she had spent trying to please everyone, trying to fix problems that weren't hers to fix, of Tyler's manipulation, of her feeling small and powerless in her own life. But as the words poured from her, she realized that those years had shaped her into who she was today. She had become someone who could stand up, who could speak her truth, even when it was uncomfortable. "I spent years feeling trapped," Eleanor continued, her voice growing stronger with each word, "believing that my worth was determined by the people around me, that if I just kept giving, if I just kept being the good mother, the good grandmother, that everything would work out. But I was wrong. My worth was never about what I could give. It was about who I was, and I had to find that out the hard way." The audience was still, hanging on every word. Eleanor could feel the weight of their attention, the understanding in their eyes. She wasn't speaking just for herself anymore. She was speaking for every woman who had ever felt small, for every person who had ever been manipulated into thinking they were anything less than worthy. "I had to face the truth that I'd let others control me, and in doing so, I lost sight of who I was. But I learned, eventually. I learned that I could choose to walk away from that, to reclaim what was mine, not just the house, but my life, my peace. And in doing so, I learned what real strength is. Not the ability to control, but the courage to be yourself, no matter the cost." As she finished speaking, there was a moment of silence before the applause began. It was gentle at first, then grew louder, stronger, as though the audience was releasing something they'd been holding onto as well. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears, tears of relief, of pride, of finally feeling seen. Clara was in the front row, smiling at her mother, and for the first time, Eleanor truly felt that she was living on her own terms. No longer defined by Tyler's actions, no longer controlled by the expectations of others. After the seminar, several organizations approached her, eager to hear more, to bring her story to wider audiences. It was an overwhelming feeling to know that her journey, her battle, had touched so many. But what she hadn't expected was the deep sense of peace that followed. Eleanor had never imagined she would stand here, in front of a room full of strangers, speaking her truth. She had never thought she would reclaim her own life in such a bold way. And yet, there she was. "I'm not just surviving anymore," Eleanor whispered to herself, a smile breaking across her face. "I'm living." But even as she basked in the applause, a voice inside her stirred. There was always more to do. More women to help. More lives to touch. Eleanor knew that her journey wasn't just about her own liberation anymore. It was about giving others the tools to find their own. And as the evening wore on, she realized that this was just the beginning. Eleanor sat at her desk, the morning sun streaming through the window and casting soft rays over her notebook. The pages lay blank before her, yet she felt no hesitation. The words she had been carrying for so long were ready to be released, ready to take shape on paper. She could almost hear the echoes of the women she had met, their voices rising in solidarity, each one sharing a piece of their journey, just as she had shared hers. It wasn't just about writing a book. It wasn't about telling her story for the sake of recognition or fame. Eleanor had made her peace with her past, but she knew that the power of her words could become a tool, a lifeline for others who were still stuck in the places she once was. Her journey, her survival, her triumphs, these things could help build something greater than herself. Her pen moved across the page with purpose, each sentence weaving the story of how she had broken free, how she had reclaimed her life and her power. The words poured out of her, a cathartic release, but also a map for others to follow. She wrote for the women who felt powerless, who had been told for years that their voices didn't matter, that their worth was bound up in their ability to please others. She wrote for them. And, in doing so, she wrote for herself, an act of healing that had become a full-circle journey. By the time she finished the first chapter, Eleanor felt a sense of purpose she had never known. Writing had always been something she pushed aside, but now it was not only a way to release the past, it was a tool to reshape the future. Her foundation, which had started as a modest idea to help women facing financial manipulation, was growing, attracting attention from people who had read about her story in articles, heard her speak at seminars, or seen the ripple effect of her work in communities. The donations came pouring in, small and large, from people who believed in her mission. Volunteers signed up in droves, ready to help expand her vision into new areas. It was as if the world had been waiting for a movement like this, a movement to show women that they were not alone, that they had the strength to rise up and take control of their financial futures. Eleanor had always believed that true empowerment came from within, but she now understood that it also came from community, connected, united, and relentless. She had spent too many years isolated, trapped in her own doubts and fears. Now, she was part of something much bigger. One afternoon, Clara joined her at the office, both of them stepping into the new space Eleanor had transformed into a community hub for the foundation. The walls were lined with shelves of books on financial literacy, self-help, and empowerment. A large table sat in the center, filled with pamphlets, sign-up sheets, and binders of resources for women to take with them. "This place is incredible, Mom," Clara said, her eyes shining with pride. "I can't believe how much you've done." Eleanor smiled, her heart swelling. She had always known that Clara was her strength, but watching her daughter grow into someone who understood her purpose, who shared her vision, filled her with an overwhelming sense of pride. "We've done it together, sweetheart," Eleanor replied, her voice full of quiet satisfaction. "This is just the beginning. We're giving women the tools to take their power back." Clara nodded, walking over to one of the bookshelves and running her fingers over the spines. "You're changing lives, Mom. I don't think you even realize how much of an impact you're having." Eleanor looked at her daughter, then out the window at the bustling street below. For so many years, She had been held back by her own fears, thinking she was too old, too small, too insignificant to make a difference. But now, she knew differently. She was creating something that would outlast her, something that would change the lives of countless women for years to come. The foundation wasn't just a place, it was a movement. It was a lifeline to women who had been manipulated, controlled, and silenced. It was a place for them to reclaim their autonomy, their financial freedom, and their voice. As Eleanor and Clara traveled together to speak at women's empowerment events across the country, Eleanor saw the ripple effect of her work growing. From one city to another, women stood up to share their stories, their struggles, and their victories. In these rooms, Eleanor was no longer just the speaker. She was the listener, the mentor, the guide. She realized that the work was never really about her. It was about creating space for others to step into their own power. And the best part? It was working. Eleanor's business flourished as the foundation gained momentum, attracting more funding, more volunteers, and more partnerships with other women's organizations. She was able to give back to the community in ways she had never imagined, mentoring young women, teaching them financial independence, helping them find their voice in a world that often told them to remain silent. It wasn't just the work she was doing now that brought her peace. It was the future she was building. She had spent so many years feeling like a passenger in her own life, letting others control her narrative. But now, she was the author. She was in the driver's seat. One evening, as Eleanor sat at her desk, reflecting on everything she had accomplished, a letter arrived. She opened it slowly, her hands trembling just slightly as she read the words. It was an invitation to speak at an international conference on women's empowerment. Her story was reaching further than she had ever dreamed, and now there was an opportunity to bring it to an even wider audience. She stared at the letter for a long time, letting the weight of it sink in. The ripple had become a wave, and the world was finally listening. The past had shaped her, but it no longer defined her. The woman who once lived in the shadows was now stepping into the light, ready to continue building, ready to continue fighting. Not for herself, but for all the women whose voices had been silenced. And as she looked ahead, Eleanor knew this was just the beginning. There was more to do. So much more. Eleanor leaned back in her chair, the sound of the waves crashing against the shore filling the quiet of her hotel room. The ocean stretched out before her, endless and serene. She hadn't planned on taking this much time off, but something inside her had shifted after the international conference. She realized that while she had poured everything into building the foundation, into speaking and guiding, she had forgotten the importance of simply living. And living, Eleanor was learning, meant savoring the quiet moments, the time spent with herself, with the people she loved, in places that felt like they could hold her peace. She had left her work behind for a few weeks, a rare act of self-care that felt more like a revolution than a luxury. Her foundation was thriving. The ripple effect of her work was unstoppable, and Clara was by her side every step of the way, helping guide the growth of the nonprofit. But now she was in a small seaside town in Oregon, far from the bustle of city life, with only the sound of the ocean to keep her company. It was a strange feeling, one she had almost forgotten. Freedom. Her mornings were slow. She woke early, watching the sun rise over the water, the light painting the sky in shades of pink and orange. Eleanor had always rushed through life, constantly preparing for the next task, the next challenge. But here, she had no deadlines, no one to answer to but herself. She wandered the beach, collecting sea glass and driftwood, and for the first time in a long time, she let herself just be. No expectations, no guilt. One afternoon, she received a call from Clara. The two of them had become closer in these past months, and their bond was something Eleanor never could have imagined before. Their relationship had been strained for years, filled with misunderstandings and resentments. But now it was built on trust, respect, and shared strength. "Mom, you wouldn't believe it," Clara said, her voice full of excitement. "We've just signed a huge partnership with a national organization. They're going to help fund a new initiative for financial literacy workshops for women in rural areas. This is huge." Eleanor felt a surge of pride mixed with gratitude. "I'm so proud of you, Clara. This is your hard work, too." Clara laughed, the joy in her voice unmistakable. "No, Mom, this is our work. You've inspired me every single day." As they talked, Eleanor realized that the foundation wasn't just her vision anymore, it was theirs. And as much as the world had needed her to find her voice, she now saw how much she had needed them too. Later, she spent the evening with a small group of friends she had met during her travels, a group of women who had come together through their own journeys of self-discovery. They gathered around a table at a cozy cafe overlooking the ocean, sharing stories, laughter, and good food. Eleanor found herself smiling, feeling light in a way she hadn't in years. These were the people who truly understood her, the ones who shared in her passion, who listened without judgment, and who celebrated the beauty of what she had become. Her life had become something she could never have imagined when she was mired in the suffocating grip of Tyler's control. She had let him take up so much space in her life, letting his manipulation dictate her choices. But now, as she sat among friends, the cool evening breeze brushing against her skin, she felt the truth of it. She was the one who had reclaimed her life. She had taken back what had always been hers. That night, Eleanor sat by her hotel window, the soft glow of the moon casting silver light over the water. She hadn't felt so calm in years. The work would always be there, the foundation would continue to grow, and the women she was helping would continue to thrive. But now, she could finally breathe. Eleanor had started painting again. The act of creating had always been something she loved, but it had fallen by the wayside as life swept her up in its demands. But now, she was reclaiming that part of herself, each brushstroke a small act of rebellion against the years she had spent trying to please everyone else. The small canvas in front of her was filled with bold strokes of color, vibrant oranges and deep blues, shades of pinks and purples. It wasn't about creating something perfect. It was about releasing what was inside her, just as she had done with her story. She was starting to exhibit her work at local galleries, allowing herself to take pride in the beauty she was creating, not because she needed validation, but because it was a part of her soul that had long been buried. As the sun began to set, Eleanor stepped outside, walking down to the beach to collect more sea glass. She could hear the laughter of children in the distance, the call of seagulls above, and the gentle rhythm of the waves. She smiled to herself, the world stretching out before her, full of possibilities. She had spent so many years holding her breath, waiting for permission, waiting for something to change. But now, she had changed. And for the first time in years, Eleanor Thompson was living, truly living, on her own terms. In that moment, she realized there was no turning back. The woman who had been bound by expectations and fear was no more. She had become someone new, someone free, someone who was ready to face the next chapter, with all its challenges and rewards. And just as she thought that, a thought struck her like a flash of light. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about the generations of women who would look back and see that it was possible to break free, to find themselves, and to step into their power. Eleanor smiled, walking along the shore as the last rays of daylight faded into the horizon. There was still so much more to do, but now, with her heart light and her purpose clear, she was ready for whatever came next. Eleanor sat in her office, the morning light streaming in through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the hardwood floor. The room had once felt foreign to her, an office space, a symbol of work and obligation. But now it felt like home, a place where ideas flourished and futures were shaped. She ran her fingers over the spine of her book, which lay open in front of her, the pages filled with the story she had shared with the world. It had become a bestseller. The words she had once written for herself, to release the weight of years spent in silence, had reached millions. Her story, her triumph, had resonated with women across the globe. They wrote to her, told her how her words had given them the courage to step out of the shadows, to reclaim their lives. Eleanor had never imagined this level of impact, never thought her voice would echo in places she could only dream of. But now, she saw it clearly. This was bigger than her. Her foundation had grown beyond her expectations. The initial vision had been a modest one, to help women facing financial manipulation, but the reach of that mission had exploded. With the support of generous donors and tireless volunteers, Eleanor had created scholarships for young women, helping them learn financial literacy and independence. Women who once had no idea how to break the cycle of debt and dependence were now empowered to take control of their futures. Clara was at her side every step of the way. Together, they had transformed the foundation into a thriving organization that was changing lives, lifting women up from situations of financial hardship, and teaching them how to stand on their own. "I never thought this day would come," Clara said one evening as they reviewed the foundation's growth. "You've built something incredible, Mom." Eleanor looked at her daughter, her heart swelling with pride. "It's ours, Clara. We've built it together." The work wasn't done, though, not by a long shot. As the foundation continued to expand, Eleanor saw the need for more. There were women everywhere who still didn't have access to the resources they needed. She began investing in new projects, safe spaces for women in financial need, places where they could find not just shelter, but guidance, mentorship, and opportunities to rebuild their lives. These spaces became sanctuaries for women who were ready to rise, ready to take back what had been taken from them. And Eleanor's work was far from unnoticed. Invitations to speak at international conferences came flooding in. She became a sought-after voice, someone whose story had inspired a movement. She had gone from being the woman who lived in the shadows to being the one who stood at the front, telling the world what was possible when women stopped apologizing for their existence and started claiming their space. But even as the accolades came, Eleanor knew that the most important work was done in the quiet moments, when a woman found the courage to take her first step toward independence, or when a young girl realized she didn't have to follow the same path of silence and submission that her mother or grandmother had walked. She began a mentorship program, teaching women how to manage their finances, how to create a budget, how to invest in themselves. She had been there once, unsure of how to navigate the complexities of financial independence, unsure of how to break free from the cycle that had kept her trapped. Now, she could teach others what she had learned the hard way. Clara, too, had found her place within the foundation. As she watched the organization grow, she realized how much she had inherited from her mother. Not just the mission to empower women, but a deep sense of responsibility to make the world a better place. Eleanor often joked that Clara had become her biggest asset, but the truth was that they had become partners in the truest sense. The bond they had shared as mother and daughter had blossomed into something even more powerful, a partnership grounded in mutual respect and shared vision. One afternoon, as Eleanor walked through the Foundation's latest safe space, watching a group of women sit in a circle discussing budgeting and financial independence, she felt a swell of emotion in her chest. This was the legacy she had built. Not the house, not the money, but this. This was what she had worked for all these years. This was the purpose that had given her the strength to stand tall, even when the world tried to tear her down. Her eyes scanned the room, filled with the faces of women who had come from all walks of life: mothers, daughters, sisters, each one at a different stage of her journey, but all united by a common goal: to be free, to take back control. Eleanor smiled to herself, feeling a quiet satisfaction in the stillness of the moment. The weight of the past no longer hung around her shoulders. She had become the woman she had always wanted to be, the woman she was meant to be. And the ripple effect of that transformation had created something far greater than she had ever dreamed. As she left the building, her phone buzzed in her pocket. Another invitation. This time, it was for an international women's conference in Europe, an opportunity to share her story with an even wider audience. She had become a global voice, and the world was listening. But as Eleanor stood in the doorway, looking out at the world that had changed so much in just a few years, she felt something new: the anticipation of what was to come. The future. She had started this journey not knowing where it would lead, but now she saw it clearly. There was no end. There was always more to do, more women to reach, more lives to change. And for the first time, Eleanor Thompson wasn't just looking ahead. She was living in the moment. She had found peace. She had found her purpose. This was her legacy. And it was only the beginning. The sunlight poured into Eleanor's home as the morning broke, painting the room in soft hues of gold. She stood by the window, gazing out over the garden she had spent years tending, the flowers in full bloom. It had been a long road to this peace, and the quiet beauty of the world around her was the perfect reflection of everything she had worked for, everything she had fought for. Eleanor's heart swelled with pride as she looked at the foundation she had built, not just in the physical sense, but in the hearts of so many women whose lives had been touched by her work. The ripple effect was far-reaching, across states, countries, even continents. Her book had empowered women to reclaim their independence. Her foundation had created real change, and her message had become a beacon of hope for those who felt powerless. She had secured not just her own future, but the futures of so many others. Her work had provided safe spaces for women in need, educated them about financial independence, and empowered them to make their own decisions. What had started as a quiet mission had grown into a movement, a testament to the strength of the women who had shared their stories with her, the women who had helped her along the way. The quiet satisfaction of knowing that her legacy would live on was a peace Eleanor had never imagined possible. It had taken everything in her to reach this point, but as she sat at her desk, reviewing the latest report from the foundation, she felt no more pressure. There were no more looming threats. The storms of her past had passed, and now there was only calm. Clara, always by her side, had stepped fully into her own role in the foundation. She had grown so much over the years, not just as a professional, but as a person. Her relationship with Eleanor had deepened, transforming from the strained connection of the past to a partnership built on mutual respect, shared vision, and a bond that was unbreakable. Watching her daughter flourish in her career, leading programs, building new initiatives, and driving the foundation forward, filled Eleanor's heart with a pride that words could scarcely capture. "Mom, I'm so proud of us," Clara said one evening as they sat together on the porch, the sun dipping low in the sky. "Look at what we've built." Eleanor smiled, her gaze drifting over the garden that had become a symbol of new beginnings, of life growing after years of being stifled. "We've built it together, sweetheart." It wasn't just the foundation that had flourished. It was the family. Eleanor spent more time with her grandchildren now, guiding them in ways that were different from how she had raised her own children. She shared with them not just the practical lessons she had learned over the years, about money, independence, and resilience, but the deeper lessons too, the lessons about strength and self-worth, about love and loyalty, about never letting anyone define you. One afternoon, She sat on the floor of her living room, surrounded by her grandchildren. Tommy, the younger of the two, looked up at her with wide eyes. "Grandma, can you tell me again how you made everything work?" he asked innocently. Eleanor chuckled, her heart full. "I didn't make everything work, Tommy, but I learned how to stand up for myself, to make my own choices. And when you stand tall, no one can push you down." Her granddaughter Emma sat beside her, nodding thoughtfully. "Like when you told Uncle Tyler no?" Eleanor's smile softened, the memories of that battle still fresh in her mind, but no longer painful. "Exactly. Sometimes saying no is the hardest thing to do, but it's also the most important." As the children ran off to play, Eleanor sat back, letting the peace of the moment wash over her. It was a peace that came from knowing she had done everything she could to make the world a better place for them. The weight of the past, of manipulation, of doubt, of fear, no longer had a hold on her. She had created a legacy of strength, one that was woven through the very fabric of her family and her community. Her phone buzzed with another invitation, another opportunity to speak, another chance to reach more women. But this time, Eleanor didn't feel the pressure to accept every opportunity. She had worked hard to build this life, but now, the moments of stillness, of rest, were just as important as the work. She had given so much of herself, and now it was time to enjoy the peace that had eluded her for so long. Clara had become an equal partner in running the foundation, and Eleanor had the peace of knowing it was in good hands. Their shared vision would continue, but now there was room for Eleanor to take a step back, to enjoy the life she had worked so hard to build. She sat in her chair, the sunlight warming her face, and looked around at the people she had brought together, at the women whose lives she had touched, at the children who would grow up knowing their worth. For the first time, Eleanor felt no need to prove anything to anyone. She had nothing left to fight for except her own peace. The world had tried to take everything from her, her voice, her legacy, her sense of self. But they never took her peace. That she had claimed all on her own. Eleanor sat back in her chair, a smile tugging at her lips as she gazed out at the horizon. The future was wide open, full of possibilities. She was ready for whatever came next, but for now, she was content. And for the first time in her life, that was enough.